Welcome back for our final session. I hope everyone had a meaningful and as joyous a holiday as is possible under the present circumstances and under the shadow of the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which certainly put even more of a damper on the holiday than was already there. So this is our final session, so there are a couple of things that I want to get out of the way relatively early. One, if you check your chat, okay, thank you for that, Ellen, and I will try to find that out right now. I'm surprised that they sold you an earlier edition, but I don't know where you ordered it, so okay. Anyway, I put in the chat my email at the top there, and then the website for the contemporarymussar.org, and then a list of some of my books for people who might be interested. A Responsible Life, which is an introduction to Mussar. So thank you. Ellen has just put the ISBN number in the chat also for Mesilat Yesharim. In Search of the Holy Life, reading Levinas and reading Talmud, which is really not directly Mussar related, but for those of you who are interested in following up that part of my that influence on my work. And then there's Mesilat Yesharim, which is a commentary from a contemporary Mussar point of view. So those are in the chat, and I would remind you also that all of you should have received information about our upcoming Seeds of Mussar program, which starts in October. But if you feel that this experience with me has provided you with enough of Seeds of Mussar so that you're interested in actually starting in the the kind of the meat of the Mussar program with our what we call our foundations class, you will find on our website that we have a foundations class also starting up relatively soon, and I believe is still open for people to register. So I would really recommend that if you're interested in any and all of this, that you check out our website. Okay. While you're there, by the way, we just finished a 6-week Elul program once a week, that I believe the recordings are up there, and you might find some or all of those of interest. I see that Sanford Goldstein has already signed up for Foundations. Yesher Koach, Mazel Tov. And I hope some of you will join in. Marilyn, you too? Great. Okay. All right, that's the first piece of business. Let's wrap the next piece of business into our actual work. So let's begin with the bracha, which should appear momentarily. There we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so as it happens, today's work will in fact specifically be focused on some words of Torah, and I'll get to that in a moment. But before that, I wanted to ask if any of you have or feel like sharing any reflections on I believe the middah that I had given you to work on was the middah of seder, the middah of orderliness. And I wondered whether anyone had sort of played with that and thought about that in terms of their daily reflection. And if we have anybody who wants to share, we can put the recording on pause. So let me know. Give you a second. Recording now. And so what I'd like to do for, let's say the next couple of minutes, because my program, so to give you a little bit of a seder here, I want to leave a good chunk of time near the end for people to share questions or comments or things that they felt were unclear or things that they'd like more information about, so that there's a sense that everybody has a chance to feel that that they have had their questions or their thoughts answered or aired. So, but we have enough time to start with at least 10 or 15 minutes of a little bit of study. So I just have to find where that is on my screen. Okay, let me go back to my screen and put that up there. Now, good. Back to Zoom, share screen. Here we go. Okay, I'm getting very good at this. All right. So this is a handout that we sometimes use, that I thought might be of interest to people again in this final session, and that is to sort of just in a very, very general way to track the presence of Mussar in the history of Jewish thought and Jewish texts. And in a certain way, this goes back to what I hope I explained at the beginning. And if I didn't, I have an opportunity to do it now. And that is that as a term, right, as an idea, if you will, Mussar has two meanings in the history of Jewish literature. Number one, of course, is that it describes a genre of literature. And that genre of literature is generally thought to start around the 9th or 10th century, usually credited with being the first sort of official Mussar text is the book called Duties of the Heart by Ibn Bachya ibn Bakuda, an Egyptian rabbi in the 10th century. But in a certain sense, though that's often described by scholars as the first Mussar text, we want to be, I think, sure to understand that Mussar, in a certain way, is definitive of Judaism. That is, it's been part of the Jewish thought process from the very beginning, right? That in a certain sense, the idea of living what I call the responsible life, or living the ethical life, has been at the core of the sacred literature and sacred practice of Jews from the beginning. So as just a kind of an example, we look at the Torah, and let's say the Torah dates from around 1300 BCE. Now, that's a very strange date, actually, and it does not take into account the difference between the texts that are in the Torah and the organization and promulgation of those texts, right? So the Torah that we have does not take the shape that it has today until probably early or late in the first temple period. So sometime around 500 BCE, right? Either just before or just after the return of Jews to the beginning of the building of the Second Temple under Ezra, who most likely organized Jewish literature that existed previously into the specifics of the Torah that we have today. So you always have to make that distinction, right? There's the Torah as we see it, but that isn't to say that the material in the Torah isn't much older. So we're dating this particular piece of Torah in its potentially in its origin around 13 BCE. So we know this I think these are very common statements. When you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back to him. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with him. And then that idea is recapitulated in a book that is quite a bit later, most likely, and that is in Deuteronomy. If you see your fellow's ass or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. You must help raise it. So here, and we could have picked many other verses, obviously, but here you have a specific representation, if you will, of the idea of bearing the burden with the other person, or bearing the other person's burden, or bearing the other person as your burden, which is in many ways how we now still define the goal of Mussar work, right? And although we don't have it in this particular printout, it is, as you will see in a moment, it is this idea of bearing the other as one's burden that later Mussar masters would interpret as being the definition of what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha is one of those verses that everybody likes to say and everybody likes to point to, but it's really not that easy to define what it means, right? What does it mean to love your neighbor? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? What does it mean to love yourself? We get into all kinds of circular conversations. But if we understand that verse, love your neighbor as yourself, in the context of the literature out of which it comes, then this idea that love has a specific, what we might call specific Israelite meaning, is not particularly far-fetched, and that is the ability to see the other person struggling with a burden and feel obligated. And the obligation is not unimportant here, right? This is not like maybe you should do this or you should think about doing this. This is your commandment, and that also is not an unimportant aspect of the Mussar understanding and the Jewish understanding of ethical life. And that is that it is not voluntary, that we are born, as it were, under the yoke of a commandedness that is captured by the Torah, but is actually an existential experience that the Torah captures and describes. Okay, so we have this idea of bearing the burden of the other, literally expressed in the Torah. I'm going to stop the share just for a second so I can see people's faces. I like to just make sure there aren't questions or comments right there. Okay. Betsy, are you trying to indicate you have something to say, or you're muted? So you were just fooling around with your screen. Okay, so let's go back. So then we come to Pirkei Avot, which everybody is familiar with. But this selection from Pirkei Avot is not one of the really famous ones that goes on a poster or anything. It is from the 6th chapter of Pirkei Avot, which is part of the Mishnah, which was published around the year 200 of the Common Era, and it reads as follows. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll sort of go through it quickly. The Torah is acquired through 48 qualifications. They are by study, by attentive listening, by proper enunciation, by an understanding and perceptive heart, by reverence, by awe, by humility, by joy, etc., etc., etc. You can check this text in any of the copies of Pirkei Avot that you have, chapter 6. But the 38th of this list of ways in which the Torah is acquired is by sharing burdens with one's fellow. Or if you wanted to translate it a little less literally, by bearing the burden with one's fellow, or even bearing the burden of one's fellow, right? So you have a almost direct connection between that law that was stated in a very agricultural and a very practical situation in the Torah, abstracted a little bit to becoming an independent idea for how the Torah is acquired. Now let's stop for a second and ask two questions, right? Or at least one question to begin with. What does it mean to phrase this Mishnah in this way? What does it mean to acquire Torah?
Well, I would say actually to really to live by it. I mean, to really like not just read it or have it as an other thing, but like own it in a way that it is yours internally as well, you know, as externally. That it's not another, it's not outside of you.
Okay,
That makes sense.
good. Anybody else? Acquire Torah. Let me ask the question this way. How do I want to ask this question? In what way does the phrase, how does one acquire Torah, influence what we think Torah is? Ellen?
When I think of acquiring Torah, I think of practicing Torah in the very real sense of that word, that it's not something you get immediately. It's something you work at and work at and work at and work at, and you get better at it as you continue to do that.
Good, thank you. So that's similar to what Marilyn said, but maybe going a little further. Great. But in a sense, what both of you, it seems to me, have expressed is that that what Torah isn't is merely a text, right? That Torah is not a text because you don't acquire a text, right? You read a text, maybe you can hold a text, but the idea of acquisition here, and I think both of you are right, implies some kind of internalization, some kind of almost like putting on a garment, right? Wearing Torah, so that Torah encompasses you and defines who you are, right? So the very idea that the Mishnah speaks of acquiring Torah already kind of begins to set the scene for understanding these characteristics that we've seen in the Mishnah in a slightly different way. Okay, so if we go back to the text, we see that this Mishnah is commented upon. So now we've gone from the 1300 BC to the 2nd century CE, and now we're going to the 19th century, right? And this is from a book called Chachma Mussar. So now we're smack dab in the middle of the Mussar tradition. It was written by Rabbi Simcha Zissel, one of the 3 primary students of Rav Yisrael Salanter. Rav Simcha Zissel, as did the other 2 students of Salanter, founded his own Mussar Yeshiva. There were 3 major Mussar Yeshivot that were founded by the students of Rabbi Salanter. One is in the city of Navardak, one is in the city of Slobodka, and one is in the city of Kelm, not to be confused with Chelm, right? Kelm in Lithuania was the site of the yeshiva of Rabbi Simcha Zissel, who in his book Chachma Mussar says, and this translation and commentary is by me, this is found as an appendix in the book A Responsible Life. Our sages taught one of the methods by which the Torah is acquired is by carrying the burden of our fellow. Each of the 48 steps that they enumerate there are like preliminary goals achieved by following each step in order to bring about the ultimate goal. All of them taken together instill in one a new nature, that of being a master of a fine soul, one fit for Torah and wisdom to be attached to, as a result of which one's soul is bound up in the bond of eternal life. Without this, it is impossible to acquire Torah, for it is a spiritual entity and cannot attach itself to one who does not merit it on account of one's continuing preoccupation with material matters. Now, if we had enough time, I would read that again and think about it a little bit and let it sink in, but let me point out some of the fascinating points in this, and then I'll again stop and ask for questions and comments, right? Number 1, Rav Simcha Zissel clearly and arbitrarily, which is of course symbolic of the freedom that Jewish exegetes, Jewish commentators have always taken with the text, right? Rav Simcha Zissel takes this list of 48 ways in which Torah is acquired, and he arbitrarily lifts this one, which is actually, as we saw, I think, what is it, number 36, and he makes it number 1. He says all of the other ways in which Torah is acquired are stepping stones to reaching this ultimate goal. And that ultimate goal is achieving or creating a new nature and allowing the Torah to adhere to this new nature. So number 1, he lifts this out of the context and makes it number 1. Number 2, he suggests in no uncertain terms that Torah is not a text, but is what he calls a spiritual garment. Number 3, he suggests also in no uncertain terms that this spiritual garment only can adhere to a person who has already refined his or her soul through these various steps that the Mishnah enunciates, up to and including being ready to bear the burden of the other, which is, tremendously, it seems to me, significant, because what he's saying is that Torah can only be acquired by the person who has already refined his or her character. Okay? That if you do not have this refined character, you cannot wear Torah, you cannot put it on, it will not adhere to you, it cannot be internalized. In a sense, you render it into being merely a text, as opposed to the spiritual garment that it is. And Rav Simcha Zissel goes on and says, to reach the level of being one who bears the burden of one's fellow is impossible unless one has accustomed oneself to love one's neighbor in thought and deed. So here you have, to sort of end this little piece, a specific connection made by Rav Simcha Zissel at the end of the 19th century between the idea of bearing the other, or bearing the burden with the other, and the idea of loving one's neighbor as oneself. That is, to love one's neighbor as oneself, it requires the commitment of thought and deed, action, to reach out and help that person carry whatever that person's burden happens to be. And that burden certainly is no longer the burden of a lost ox as it was 1,000 years earlier, or 2,000 years earlier, or 3,000 years earlier, actually, but now becomes a much more abstract and general idea. And that what we're doing in Mussar ultimately is learning to bear that burden with the others with whom we are in relationship. So that's a little bit of our Torah. And of course, the program that Rav Simcha Zissel developed, beginning with the program that he learned from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, but then expanded in a number of different ways, that was in use at the yeshiva in Kelm, becomes the model that we in the Center for Contemporary Mussar have patterned our program after. Right? All right, questions, comments, complaints? Lucy, you have to unmute.
First of all, I want to thank you very much, Rabbi Stone, because I've really connected to something, as I told you, I already know on a metaphysical level. But to put it and take the matot on and wrap yourself in a spiritual garment is something new that I'm trying to do for myself. And it really opens up the soul, and I want to thank you for that. It's really incredible.
Well, thank you, and you're welcome. And I would urge you to, like I said, join in to our foundation course and see how far this can go for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments about the text? Okay, so we will leave it at that. And now we have about 15 minutes or so left, 20 minutes maybe. And I really wanted to leave this nice chunk of time for people to share their feelings, their responses, or their questions about the entire 6 weeks that we've been together, and things that I could maybe add some more information about. Judah, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you for this course. It's really been wonderful, but I've been meaning to ask you, and if you could just briefly explain kibush again?
Okay. So we divide the program, and again, when I say we are basing the outline of our program on the work of Rabbi Stone and his students. Obviously, we've modified it significantly for contemporary use, but the basic outline is original, and that is that there are two levels, let's call it, of Mussar practice. As you say, one is called kibush, which literally translates as repress or suppress, and tikkun, which is transformation. So the theory is that before you can advance to dealing with transformation, you have to become familiar with, if you will, the inner workings of your responses, right? So kibush is a program that is focused on noticing when your nefesh closes and when that closure creates what we call Yetzer Hara energy, right? So I become defensive, I become angry, I become whatever, and that closes my nefesh. And then all of my actions will be will be grounded in that Yetzer Hara energy. So the way I speak to people, the way I act with people, will all be influenced by that Yetzer Hara energy. And so we want to, number one, recognize when that happens. Try to begin to understand why it happens, but most importantly, to create practices that allow us to get control over those Yetzer Hara responses, right? We can't get rid of the Yetzer Hara yet. We're not ready to transform that energy into pure Yetzer HaTov, good energy, but we can minimize the damage, right? If we can recognize that we're acting out of Yetzer Hara energy, then we can use the midot to help us get control of those responses and mitigate them. Right? So that's the kibush process. The tikkun processes are somewhat more complicated, as you might imagine, in which we begin to be able to avoid having that Yetzer Hara response at all, right? But to transform our inner life so that it is always ready to respond from Yetzer Tov, which is, as I said, is a step further. Is that helpful? Okay. I saw another hand, Marilyn.
I want to join the chorus of saying thank you. This has been very transforming and really needed, and really hit me in a very, really deep place. And I really thank you for bringing this in a way that had to come from Torah, which is what I need. Because Mussar before this was always midot, and it just, I don't know, it just didn't feel a place I wanted to go. And hearing it come from Torah really touched me. But the other thing I kind of wanted to bring up because of the pandemic is that all of a sudden also came up about Rabbi Stone of what he did during the pandemic in his life that I've been reading about now since I heard about it. And the fact, it really makes so much more sense having learning that while taking this class of, and for those who don't know, I mean, he actually like went to a temple and like he ate during the cholera epidemic in 1849, whenever it was, on Yom Kippur, because he told people, no, this is more important. And they Louis Jacobed him. They they were not happy with what was happening, but it just made me want this even more, that someone who was distilling this lived that kind of life was just really mind-blowing, I have to say.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. Let me recommend, as I said earlier, if you go to our website, we had a 6-week program on for Elul. And there were 4 rabbis, aside from me teaching. I taught the first week, then there were 4 rabbis for the next 4 weeks, and then I taught the last week. And the last week was on a Mussar concept that I haven't really mentioned at all here. So since you kind of bring it up, let me talk about it. And it's called Zikui HaRabim, which was part of Rav Yisrael's original paradigm. And Zikui HaRabim is translated loosely as doing righteousness for the public. And it was considered the final step in Mussar practice. So you began with Cheshbon HaNefesh, with internal, introspection. You used what he called hitpa'alut, right? The idea of doing this internal Cheshbon HaNefesh. You used Chavruta, you had a study partner. You used Mussar study itself, that is the literature. You used the Vad, that is the group of people that helped you clarify, let's say, your Mussar issues. But then the final step in Rav Salanter's program, which I spoke about on the 6th of the 6 weeks, is called Zikui HaRabim, which is ultimately the goal, in a sense, of Mussar. That is to say, the goal of Mussar is not to feel better. The goal of Mussar is not to feel like you've achieved some kind of internal spiritual peace. Rather, the goal of Mussar is to enable you to act in the world for the good of the world. It's kind of an activist's program. And by example, as Marilyn has indicated, Rav Salanter himself in the cholera epidemic, and you're right, I don't remember the date, but I think it was maybe 88, I'm not sure. Because he believed in the science of the time and the medical authorities who cautioned that an entire community that did not eat or drink for 24 hours and therefore made themselves weak and susceptible to disease, was a program for mass infection. And Rav Salanter, in order to avoid this happening over Yom Kippur, and there are actually 2 versions of the story, Marilyn. So one is a little bit more dramatic than the other, but the more dramatic story is that he got up on the bima on Kol Nidre, and he made kiddush, and he brought cake, and he ate, and he established rooms around the synagogue where they would have cake and drinks and food available throughout Yom Kippur. And he urged people that when they were hungry or thirsty to leave services and go in and get something to strengthen themselves so that they would not be making themselves more susceptible to disease. And I pointed out that there are many ways in which this is a model for contemporary spiritual action, if you will. And as it happens, 3 years ago, I guess it was, right after the Charlestown neo-Nazi march that took place.
Charlottesville.
Charlottesville, thank you. There was organized a Black Lives Matter march on Washington that was organized to take place on Yom Kippur. And while many in the Jewish community were very upset that this had been scheduled for Yom Kippur, and some in the Jewish community figured out ways in which Jews could go and have a service and then also go to the march, and et cetera, et cetera. I felt strongly that for Jews to go to the march and organize services and be publicly celebrating Yom Kippur on the march would attract the media in such a way as to divert attention from the actual goal of the march, which was to focus on the Charlottesville events. And so I decided to go with I announced to my congregation that I would not be there for Yom Kippur. Of course, I was no longer the rabbi, I was the rabbi emeritus. And I said that anybody in the congregation who wanted to join me, we were taking a train to Washington and we were marching. And to quote Rabbi Heschel, we were going to pray with our feet on Yom Kippur instead of praying in the synagogue and fasting, because what had happened in Charlottesville presaged events that have continued to only worsen in our country since then. And so yes, this is an idea and a model that I'm quite familiar with. Okay, other questions, comments, complaints? Well, I have to tell you that the Seeds of Mussar program is usually 5 weeks. So I've stretched this into 6 weeks as best I can, but we've got 10 minutes left and I'm out, I'm done. So if you don't have questions or comments, I'm going to end this a little bit early. And thank you all for really a wonderful opportunity to get to know your community a little bit. I assume all of you know that I have known your associate rabbi since she was a little girl and watched her grow up in my congregation and cannot be anything but extraordinarily proud of her, and consider yourselves very lucky to have her as a member of your clergy team. And Rabbi Russell, I will turn it back to you. And
thank you. So I had some internet issues during that, and I have lost my hosting power. You are in charge right now, so Rabbi Stone. So just make sure
I've got all the power.
You've got all the power. On the final week, I handed it over to you. No, so just make sure you hit stop or something on that recording. And yeah, a huge thank you to you, Rabbi Stone. I know that a lot of people got a lot out of this, and